It was supposed to be a quiet evening at Sandringham, but behind the thick velvet curtains, voices rose, tempers flared, and within hours, Queen Camilla was being driven away under the cover of darkness. The estate, draped in winter stillness, had always been seen as a place where the royal family could set aside public appearances and retreat into a semblance of normal life. Yet that night, the air carried a different weight, one thick with unspoken grievances and the kind of tension that even the grand walls could not contain. Sandringham, the Queen's cherished winter sanctuary, had become the stage for a drama that would ripple far beyond its gates. The occasion was meant to be one of unity. The traditional winter gathering at the estate brought together senior members of the royal family, projecting a sense of harmony to a public eager to believe the monarchy stood united. Yet, beneath the polite smiles and ceremonial toasts, a storm was gathering. The weeks leading up to the dinner had been riddled with quiet whispers in the corridors of Buckingham Palace, rumors of Camilla's growing influence over Charles's decisions, whispers that she was asserting herself in matters Anne considered sacred. Those who knew Anne well understood her. Silence was never a sign of indifference. It was the coiling of a spring, waiting for the right moment to release. Camilla's arrival at Sandringham that evening was already shadowed by suspicion. She stepped into the estate with the air of someone who knew she was being watched. Every movement measured, every word chosen with precision. But even her careful composure could not thaw the frost in Anne's reception. The Princess Royal greeted her with a politeness so clipped it was almost a dismissal. A brief exchange of words that left an unmistakable chill in its wake. The tension was palpable. An invisible line had been drawn, and everyone in the room could feel it. Dinner began under the glittering light of the chandeliers. But what should have been an evening of warm conversation quickly devolved into something else entirely. Across the long table, glances were exchanged like quiet challenges. Comments, seemingly harmless on the surface, carried sharp undertones that only their intended targets could decipher. Camilla held her ground with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to political games, but Anne's silence was louder than any insult. Every pause between courses felt heavier, as if the walls themselves were bracing for what was coming. Even the staff noticed it. The butlers, discreet and experienced, sensed the undercurrent from the moment the first course was served. They moved quietly, keeping their heads down, yet their eyes darted toward the two women more often than usual. Servants who had witnessed decades of royal life whispered to one another later that they had felt something inevitable, building a confrontation that could no longer be delayed. By the time dessert was served, the atmosphere had turned from icy to electric. It was the kind of charged quiet that came before a storm breaks, when everyone at the table is aware that the smallest spark could ignite the whole room. The only question was, who would light the match? But what began as a frosty dinner would explode into one of the most shocking confrontations in modern royal history. And it was Anne who struck the first blow. To understand why Anne lashed out, you have to go far back to the days when Camilla was just Charles's friend, and Anne's trust was shattered. The tension between them was never born from one single moment, but from a series of small betrayals, sharp-edged remarks, and unspoken judgments that had festered for decades. In the earliest years, when Camilla moved in the fringes of royal circles, Anne regarded her with cool politeness. To Anne, she was a guest in the royal orbit, a woman from outside their world who seemed far too comfortable navigating it. Behind closed doors, Anne saw her as someone who knew exactly where the power lay and wasn't afraid to move toward it. Even then, the Princess Royal had her suspicions that would, over time, harden into something far more personal. The 1980s brought the first true fracture. Diana's arrival into the family changed everything. Anne, fiercely loyal to her young sister-in-law, saw Camilla not as a harmless friend, but as a shadow hanging over Diana's marriage. While the rest of the world was enchanted by the fairy tale, Anne quietly bristled at the whispers that Camilla's presence was never truly gone. She would defend Diana in ways the public never saw, offering private comfort while internally raging at what she viewed as a deep disrespect to the sanctity of the marriage. When Diana's marriage began to collapse, Anne's opinion of Camilla moved from cautious disapproval to something close to open disdain. In the years after Diana's death, Anne's words grew sharper, even if they were rarely spoken publicly. Among trusted confidants, she made her feelings known. She spoke of women who marry for crowns with a biting clarity, the remark always landing with an unmistakable target. Even as the family presented a united front in public, Those closest to Anne knew she had no interest in rewriting history to suit Camilla's rise. The memory of what she believed had been taken from Diana was too strong to bury beneath palace protocol. When Camilla's path to becoming queen consort became inevitable, Anne's resistance was not about tradition. It was about principle. To Anne, the crown was not a trinket to be earned through proximity or persistence. It was a responsibility born of duty, sacrifice, and bloodline. She could not reconcile the woman she saw as a disruptive force in Charles's life with the image of a queen standing beside the sovereign. Each public honor Camilla received felt to Anne like a rewriting of the past she had lived through, a past she refused to forget. This silent grudge shaped every interaction between them in the decades that followed. Every handshake at an official engagement was perfectly polite, but beneath it lay a weight of history neither woman was willing to acknowledge out loud. It wasn't open warfare. It was a long, quiet game where every look, every omission, every calculated pause was a move on the board. For years, both maintained this cold truce, knowing that a direct confrontation would leave the palace reeling. But that truce was fragile, and the winter gathering at Sandringham was the moment it finally cracked. The years of swallowed words and measured restraint had reached their limit. Anne, no longer willing to bury her truth for the sake of appearances, felt the weight of decades pressing her forward. And on that winter night, Anne finally decided she would no longer hold her tongue. It began in the drawing room, away from the main dinner table, but within minutes, the entire East Wing could hear them. The warmth of the roaring fire did nothing to soften the ice between the two women. Anne stood rigid, her expression carved in stone, while Camilla faced her with a defiant tilt of the chin. The air between them was charged, heavy with years of silent resentment now breaking loose. The sound of clinking glasses and polite chatter from the dining hall seemed a world away. Here, in this smaller, more intimate space, the masks had slipped, and the truth was spilling out in sharp, unfiltered words. Anne's voice was the first to pierce the stillness, her tone cool but edged with steel. "Titles don't come with respect," she said, the words hanging in the air like a blade. "You have to earn that." It was a calculated strike, one meant to wound, not merely provoke. Camilla's eyes narrowed, the challenge clear. Without hesitation, she shot back, her voice steady but laced with venom. "And yet, I'm the only one who can manage Charles. You know it. Everyone here knows it." That remark landed like a slap. It was not just a defense. It was a declaration, a reminder that her role at the king's side was not a gift from Anne or anyone else, but a position she believed she had claimed by necessity. The exchange escalated quickly, each sentence digging deeper into wounds neither woman had intended to heal. Anne accused Camilla of rewriting history, of stepping into a crown that should have been earned through loyalty to the institution, not through persistence in the shadows. Camilla countered by hinting at the family's own hypocrisies, reminding Anne of moments in royal history where personal choices had bent tradition. From there, the conversation grew darker. More personal betrayals that had nothing to do with the monarchy were suddenly being dragged into the light. Words about Diana's memory, about family fractures, about trust that had been broken long before either of them stood in this room tonight. Servants lingered just beyond the doorway, their steps slowed to an uncertain halt. No one wanted to be the one to interrupt, but neither did they want to be caught listening. The sound of raised voices traveled quickly through the corridors, reaching ears that had no business hearing such things. Staff exchanged uneasy glances, their instincts telling them this was not merely a quarrel, but something that could spill far beyond these walls. And then came the moment that would echo through the palace long after that night. Anne, her patience spent, stepped closer and delivered the words that would cut deeper than any before. "You will never belong here, Camilla." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was said with a cold finality that left no room for rebuttal. For a moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire, and then Camilla's quiet, measured breath, as if weighing the cost of her next move. What happened next turned a private quarrel into a royal exile. In the middle of it all, a familiar figure stepped in, but the king wasn't there to play peacemaker. Charles crossed the threshold and absorbed the heat already burning between them, his gaze moving from Anne's unflinching defiance to Camilla's bristling resolve, and in that instant, he understood this wasn't a misunderstanding to smooth over, but a reckoning that had been circling his family for years. He tried the soft approach, first measured words, careful tone, an appeal to calm that sounded almost like a plea, but the argument had grown teeth. Anne challenged him with the plain severity only a sister can wield, a reminder that duty cannot be bent to accommodate personal comfort. Camilla countered with the one truth she knew would force him to choose. She said she was the only one who could manage him. When the pressure crushed the air from his lungs, that she steadied him when the crown felt heavier than his own head. Each claim landed with a separate weight, and neither let him breathe. He reached for balance, defending his wife without condemning his sister. But his carefully neutral, painfully diplomatic words satisfied no one. When he tried to move the conversation toward optics, toward the unblinking eye of the public, Anne cut through the veneer and spoke of standards that should not be negotiated. For a heartbeat too long, he seemed to nod with her, and that tiny tilt barely there, almost imagined, was enough to change the temperature in the room. Camilla saw it. She felt it. The look she gave him was not anger first, but disbelief. A flash of wounded recognition that the person who should have shielded her might let the storm roll through. Her voice turned sharp and low. "He was letting your family humiliate me," she said, and the accusation hovered between them like a verdict. Charles faltered because both sides were true. Privately, he owed her tenderness. Publicly, he owed the institution a posture that wouldn't fracture further. He understood the headlines that would follow any misstep, the council that would arrive at dawn, the donors, the diaries, the brittle alliances that kept the machine running. And still he understood the marriage he had fought to legitimize, the vows he had defended, the companionship that steadied him in the darkest hours. The contradiction split him open. He tried to speak, and found only careful phrases that explained nothing and promised less. He did not rebuke his sister. He did not embrace his wife. He chose the middle, that narrow bridge where kings often stand, hoping time will cool the ember on both sides. But time had already chosen. Camilla waited for him to refute Anne clearly, publicly, decisively. Anne waited for him to uphold a line that, once crossed, would cheapen everything the family claimed to represent. He looked from one to the other and offered the single response that always costs the most in a room full of decisive people. He said nothing. The quiet stretched, thin and dangerous. And in that suspended breath, the choice made itself. And that silence, that hesitation, was all Anne needed to make her next move. Anne had spent years holding her fire. That night, she fired every shot she had. She stood on the strength of a lineage she refused to see diluted, invoking mother's standards, not as nostalgia, but as law. And her voice carried the weight of those standards like a verdict. The crown survives by discipline, by dignity, by duty, not by noise, not by negotiation, and certainly not by headlines that stain the seal. Sandringham, she declared, was a place for the crown, not its controversies, and the words cut through the last of the polite fictions. This house, this tradition, this memory of constancy was not a stage for rehabilitation or reinvention. She turned the blade further, insisting that Camilla's presence, however defended, however explained, had begun to undermine the king's standing in a way no advisor could fix. Because the damage was not a matter of strategy, but of trust. And once trust is broken in a royal household, it echoes from chapel to balcony to the public square. Anne did not bluster. She advanced with the cold precision of someone who had waited too long to be misunderstood. She said there were things I could say that would end you tomorrow, and the sentence hung there, terrible not for its volume but for its restraint, because everyone knew she would never brandish a threat she could not deliver. Then came the order, unadorned, undeniable, to leave before morning. Not a suggestion, not a plea. A command spoken as if she were sealing a door that had been rattling on its hinges for years. The room reacted the way palaces react when truth is spoken without varnish. A stunned silence that felt heavier than any shouted reply. A silence that bounced back at Charles and wrapped itself around Camilla like a dare. He had hesitated. Anne had not. Camilla's eyes carried both fury and hurt, the raw mixture that forms when a person is told that their presence is the problem and their absence the solution. She reached for the one argument that had always steadied her, that she steadied him, and even that felt suddenly insufficient against Anne's austere calculus of duty. The Princess Royal pressed on, uncompromising, reminding them both that the monarchy's strength is not measured by who is most loved inside the family, but by who preserves the family's promise outside the gates. And if removing one person restored the promise, then that was the price. In that unblinking logic, The past was not up for renegotiation. The future demanded a sacrifice. The staff waited for a countermand that did not come. The king wrestled with consequences he could not control. And the woman at the center of the storm stared down a verdict she would not dignify with tears. Camilla had a choice to bow her head or make her own stand. The queen consort, who once commanded every room she entered, walked out that night with her head down. Pride had been her armor for years, but pride cannot muffle the sting of a verdict delivered in front of the one man who would not defend her. It only makes the sting burn longer. She crossed the threshold with hands that would not steady, fingers betraying what her face refused to reveal, and in that small trembling lived the truth. Humiliation is heavier than any crown. She did not plead, did not argue, did not give Anne the satisfaction of another word. Instead, she turned to the closest aide and, in a voice scraped clean of ornament, whispered the only command that fit the moment. "Pack everything. Now." The order ran like a fuse through the corridors, quick and quiet, and the shock traveled faster than footsteps. Staff who had practiced discretion their entire lives froze for half a second, eyes widening before discipline snapped back into place. Even so, the rumor outran the protocol, reaching doorways and stairwells and the corners where servants learned to breathe without being seen. Camilla kept moving, carrying herself like someone who knows that to stop is to shatter. She passed people who could not decide whether to curtsy or disappear, and the hesitation cut deeper than any insult. They did not know the script for this, because there is no script for a queen told to leave by dawn. In the anteroom, she paused only long enough to repeat herself immediately, quietly. Everything then continued, as if momentum alone could keep her from breaking apart. Down the corridor, an aide caught the edge of a sentence that was not meant for anyone else. "I will not spend another night here." It was resolved, scalded by hurt, the vow of someone who understands that to remain is to confirm the humiliation. Outside, a vehicle stood ready with an efficiency that said nothing and implied everything, and the first glimpse of its lights, stark, indifferent, made her swallow whatever words remained in her throat. She climbed in without ceremony, flanked by the people paid to make departures look ordinary. But nothing about this was ordinary. Not the way her staff clutched cases, as if weight could smother shame, not the way the courtyard seemed to listen, not the way the past felt suddenly louder than the future. Within minutes, a small convoy formed, quiet as contrition, and rolled away in a line that pretended to be routine. Yet, the retreat left behind a chill that no heating could lift, a shadow that slid under doors and into conversations, a mark on the estate's memory that would not fade with morning. She did not look back. She had already measured the cost and paid in silence, and silence was the only currency left to her. But while Camilla was gone, the palace was already preparing for the fallout. By morning, the press was already circling. The palace needed a story fast. Phones lit up before dawn, and the first command slid through the chain of staff, like a sealed order. No comment on Camilla's departure. No embellishment, no color, nothing that could be parsed into a headline. Silence would be the official language until a cleaner sentence could be written. In the meantime, a softer narrative was minted for anyone who demanded explanation. Camilla had left for a private engagement. A phrase deliberately vague, flexible enough to cover any gap, gentle enough to dull the edges of a night that had drawn blood. Communications aides worked in relays, stitching together talking points that sounded dignified while saying very little, and mapping every door, corridor, and chapel angle where cameras might catch the wrong person leaving the wrong room at the wrong time. Priority 1 was simple and brutal. Anne and Camilla must not be photographed apart, because two separate frames would tell a single, damning story. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere turned hotter. Charles, already wounded by the public implications of a private disaster, raged not with theatrical outbursts, but with cold, clipped frustration. Unity shredded, trust breached, and the family's shield punctured from the inside. He paced the narrow line between preserving dignity and acknowledging the obvious, swatting away suggestions that they simply lean into the private engagement line and ride it out. He knew the press would smell iron in the water and keep circling until someone bled. Meanwhile, the Queen's allies got to work, whispering a more gracious portrait of events. A long-planned commitment, a necessary schedule adjustment, a concern for the King's workload explanations that asked the public to nod politely and move along. They called in friendly voices, reached out to sympathetic columnists, and gently seeded the idea that any raised voices were overblown, that families disagree, that the machine of monarchy hums on regardless. But the strategy had a fatal crack. Anne would not play pretend. She refused to launder the evening with careful euphemisms or lend her face to an image that said everything was fine. When asked to appear for a brief, calming photo op, she declined with the kind of finality that leaves no second attempt. And her refusal sent panic skittering through the planners. Without Anne's cooperation, the optical glue would not hold. Staff rehearsed contingency routes for walkabouts and rehearsed lines that said diary commitments instead of damage control, trying to choreograph hours that no longer wished to be choreographed. Every minute extended the risk of contradiction. One stray comment from a footman. One courier arrived too publicly with luggage. One motor detail appearing on a camera log shouldn't appear on. And still, the house tried to hold its breath, to wait out the frenzy under a blanket of controlled phrases and managed silences. But institutions can only contain a secret if every heartbeat agrees to keep time. And then, a leak changed everything. One phone call to a well-connected royal correspondent, and the story broke within hours. The private engagement fiction collapsed. The instant an unnamed palace source revealed the line no spin could smother. Camilla was told to leave. It wasn't hedged. It wasn't softened. It landed like iron on a marble floor, and every newsroom in London heard the ring. Within minutes, tabloids roared to life with screaming banners of a royal bust-up at Sandringham, the words flashing across breakfast tables and timelines like a siren. Broadcasters arranged urgent segments. Commentators sharpened their knives, and the country's morning commute carried a single question: who ordered the exile? The public split along old fault lines: sympathy for a woman publicly humiliated without a shield, outrage at a queen accused of testing the boundaries of tradition, while the undecided simply stared, stunned by the cruelty of a family argument dragged into daylight. Social media, never patient, caught fire with speculation about what was said. Some swore Anne had invoked mother's standards. Others claimed Camilla had snapped that she alone could steady the king, and still others insisted the quarrel was the culmination of promises broken long ago. Threads multiplied and mutated, amateur sleuths mapping decades of glances and handshakes, while influencers milked the scandal for views, and self-appointed experts spoke like witnesses to a storm they hadn't seen. Inside the machine, Camilla's camp pointed fingers with practiced precision, suggesting Anne's disdain had grown into sabotage, that the Princess Royal had relished the moment to reassert blood over bond, duty over marriage. They whispered that Camilla had been bullied out, that she had left to prevent a deeper wound, that the monarchy's most disciplined daughter had become its most dangerous enforcer. Yet, in quiet rooms across the capital, among those who know Anne's measure, friends offered a different verdict in the unvarnished phrasing she prefers. She did what had to be done. They argued that a boundary finally had to hold, that standards had to stand for more than nostalgia, that the crown could not bend every time a personality refused to. The arguments grew louder as the day wore on. Polls snapped to attention, talk shows erupted, and the palace's strategy of no comment, controlled phrasing, gentle misdirection crumbled under the weight of a single, undeniable detail. Reporters hunted the second source, chasing confirmation of who heard what, who moved first, who flinched. Courtiers double-checked phone logs, tracing the leak like a bloodhound through corridors where silence was supposed to be the only currency. Alliances shifted by the hour, soft loyalties hardening in private vows. Some would never forgive Anne. Others would never forgive Camilla. A few would never forgive the king's hesitation. And in the middle of the uproar, one truth rang louder than the rest. The story was no longer theirs to control. It belonged to the crowd now, to the echo chamber, to the appetite that feeds on royal fracture, until only bones are left. And as the world debated, one final twist was still to come. Camilla may have left Sandringham that night, but the ripples of her exile are still shaking the monarchy today. In the months that followed, her absence from the estate became more than a scheduling choice. It became a statement. Invitations to family gatherings at Sandringham were politely declined, her aides citing prior commitments or private retreats. But those close enough to see the truth understood it was avoidance, pure and deliberate. She would not walk those halls again under the same shadow. Charles, bound by crown and conscience, found ways to see her away from royal residences, slipping into quiet locations far from the press, where the king could speak without the echo of court politics. These meetings were private, but their frequency did not go unnoticed, and every sighting carried the scent of a monarch, balancing his loyalty to his wife with the heavy weight of a family in fracture. Meanwhile, Anne's influence only grew. Subtle at first, her presence began to shape the fabric of key royal engagements. She took on roles once earmarked for others, her voice carrying more weight in the planning of ceremonial occasions and the selection of who stood where, who appeared when. Courtiers began to speak of her as a guardian of the crown, a title never formally given but informally accepted, as if her stance at Sandringham had proven her credentials in a way years of service never fully had. Her approval within certain circles of the public rose quietly, a stark contrast to Camilla's. Poll after poll showed the queen consort's favorability slipping, the lines trending downward, especially among those who had once warmed to her careful rehabilitation. For some, the story of her being asked to leave was an embarrassment. For others, it was validation that she had overstepped the bounds of her role. Inside the palace, whispers began to circulate about new conditions placed on her public appearances, carefully coordinated invitations, selective event assignments, and subtle restrictions that spoke volumes without ever being acknowledged. She was still the queen consort, still present at the king's side in major state moments, but the rhythm had changed. Every appearance seemed measured, calculated, as if the terms of her visibility had been quietly rewritten. Those who understood the inner workings of royal life saw the shift not as temporary damage control, but as a restructuring of power. And through it all, one reality settled into the bones of those watching closely. This was not a singular clash, not a burst of temper to be forgotten with time. It felt like the opening of a deeper divide, a split that might not erupt daily but would never fully heal. The monarchy thrives on the illusion of unshakable unity, yet the fault line had been drawn in public view, and no amount of careful choreography could hide it completely. Allies had been chosen, loyalties tested, and reputations reshaped. The palace could issue its denials, the papers could move on to the next scandal, but the memory of that winter night remained etched into the private histories of those who lived it and the public's collective imagination. And if history has taught us anything, it's that in the royal family, grudges are rarely buried forever. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.